My name is Marcus Webb, and I have been a forest ranger in the Willamette National Forest in Oregon for 22 years. Before I tell you what happened on February 8th, 2024, before I explain why I'm breaking every protocol I've ever sworn to uphold, I need you to understand something. If you're watching this while planning a hike in the Cascades, if you're one of those people who thinks they can handle the wilderness because you've got a GPS and a satellite phone, you need to pay attention to what I'm about to say. What happened that night, what I heard on that radio transmission, it wasn't supposed to be recorded. The Park Service made sure of that. But I kept a copy. I kept it because 3 more people went missing last month in the same area, and I can't stay silent anymore. Before continuing, if you subscribe and like the video, you will be contributing greatly to the continuation of new stories to come. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Have you ever been in the Oregon forests? Have you ever felt like the trees were watching you? Drop a comment and let me know. There is a 14 square mile area in the Willamette National Forest, roughly 8 miles northeast of the junction where Highway 126 meets Forest Road 19. That doesn't appear on any recreational maps distributed to the public. We call it the Fade Zone. Not officially, you understand. There's no sign, no warning posted at any trailhead. But every ranger who's worked this territory for more than 5 years knows exactly what I'm talking about. We know because of the radio calls. We know because of the reports that get filed and then immediately reclassified. We know because of the people who walk into those trees and come out different, if they come out at all. I grew up in Eugene, spent my childhood camping with my father in these mountains. I thought I knew every trail, every creek, every ridge. I went to forestry school at Oregon State, got my degree in natural resource management, worked for the Bureau of Land Management for 3 years before I transferred to the National Forest Service. I've pulled hikers out of ravines, treated hypothermia cases in the middle of winter, tracked lost children through terrain that would break most people's spirits. I've seen black bears tear apart campsites, watched wildfires consume entire valleys, found bodies that had been exposed to the elements for weeks. I thought I had seen everything these mountains could show me. I was wrong. The first time I heard about the Fade Zone was during my second week on the job. My training supervisor, a ranger named Bill Schaffer, who'd been working the Willamette for 31 years, took me aside after our shift briefing. We were standing in the equipment room of the Mackenzie River Ranger Station. The smell of pine tar and equipment oil thick in the air, and he handed me a folded topographic map with certain areas marked in pencil. Not highlighted, not circled with a marker. Pencil marks that could be erased if someone official ever looked at them. He pointed to one section northeast of our station, an area of dense old-growth forest that straddled the boundary between designated wilderness and national forest land. The trees in that section are Douglas firs and western hemlocks that have been growing for 400 years or more, with an understory so thick that even in summer, the forest floor stays in perpetual twilight. Bill looked at me with these tired eyes, eyes that had seen too many winters and too many things he couldn't explain, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, "If you get a call from that area after 8 p.m., you don't respond until daylight. I don't care what the situation is. I don't care if someone's screaming on the radio that they're dying. You wait for dawn." I asked him why. You have to understand, I was fresh out of training. full of that righteous determination to save every person who needed help. I told him that wasn't how search and rescue worked, that we had a responsibility to respond immediately to emergencies. He just shook his head and told me I'd understand soon enough. He told me the rule existed for a reason, even if it wasn't a rule that appeared in any manual or training document. Then he told me about the radio calls. The Willamette National Forest covers 1.6 million acres of mountainous terrain in the Western Cascades. Our radio system operates on a network of repeater towers positioned on high ridges to maximize coverage, but there are still dead zones, places where the terrain blocks transmission or where the dense forest canopy creates interference. Standard operating procedure when you lose radio contact is to move to higher ground or to a clearing where you can get line of sight to a repeater tower. But in the fade zone, Bill told me, the radios work differently. They pick up transmissions that shouldn't be possible, conversations from rangers who aren't on duty, calls for help from locations that don't exist, voices that sound almost human but have this quality to them, this resonance that makes your teeth ache if you listen too long. He told me that in 1997, a ranger named Patricia Emmons received a distress call from a hiker who claimed he was trapped in a cave system beneath Carpenter Mountain. The hiker gave coordinates, described his surroundings in detail, begged for someone to come get him before dark. Patricia mobilized a rescue team, led them into the forest following the coordinates the hiker had provided. They found the cave entrance exactly where he'd described it, a narrow opening in a basalt outcropping that descended into the mountain. Patricia went in first with 2 other rangers. They were inside for 40 minutes by their watches, but when they emerged, 6.5 hours had passed outside. The rescue coordinator had already called in additional teams, had filed them as missing. And the hiker they'd been searching for, the one who'd called for help, there was no sign of him in the cave system. No gear, no footprints, no evidence anyone had been there in decades. But here's what made Patricia quit 3 months later. When they reviewed the radio logs, when they listened to the recording of the distress call, the voice on the tape wasn't asking for rescue. It was describing what it felt like to fade. It was describing the process of becoming part of the forest, of feeling your consciousness spread out through root systems and mycorrhizal networks, of experiencing time as a vast simultaneity rather than a linear progression. And the voice, when they really listened to it, when they isolated it and ran it through audio analysis, it wasn't one voice. It was 17 voices speaking in perfect unison, harmonizing in a way that human vocal cords can't physically produce. Bill told me there were protocols, unofficial ones, passed down from ranger to ranger. Never respond to calls from the fade zone after dark. Never enter the area alone. Never, under any circumstances, follow lights that appear between the trees. Never trust your compass in there, because magnetic north becomes negotiable. If you hear voices calling your name, voices that sound like your family or your friends, you turn around immediately and head for the nearest marked trail. If your watch stops working, if your GPS shows coordinates that place you somewhere impossible, you stay exactly where you are and wait for dawn. And most importantly, if someone you're with starts talking about how beautiful it is, about how they can finally see the pattern, about how time isn't what we think it is, you get them out of there immediately, even if you have to drag them. Because once someone starts to fade, once they begin to perceive what's really there in those trees, you have maybe 20 minutes to get them back to normal reality before the process becomes irreversible. I listened to Bill's warnings with the polite skepticism of someone who'd been trained in rational forestry management and evidence-based conservation. I figured he was hazing the new guy, telling campfire stories to see if I'd spook. I'd learn better. I'd learned that some campfire stories are really just warnings that people stop believing until it was too late. The first 6 months of my posting were routine. I led nature walks, maintained trails, filed reports on wildlife populations and forest health. I responded to a dozen search and rescue calls, found lost hikers, treated minor injuries, never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by standard wilderness hazards and human error. The fade zone was just another section of forest on my patrol route, notable only for how quiet it was, how few hikers ventured into that particular stretch of old growth. Then came October 13th, 2002. I remember the date because it was a Sunday, and I was working the evening shift at the Mackenzie River Station, monitoring radio traffic and doing paperwork. At 7:47 p.m., just as the last light was draining from the sky, I received a call from a ranger named David Moreno. David was 26 years old, had been with the Forest Service for 3 years, was one of those enthusiastic young rangers who genuinely loved the work. He'd been doing a late patrol near Thunder Creek, checking on some trail damage from a recent storm. His transmission came in clear. No static, no interference. He said he'd encountered a hiker who seemed confused and possibly hypothermic, a woman in her 30s who claimed she couldn't find her way back to the trailhead. David said he was going to escort her out, estimated he'd be back at his vehicle in about 90 minutes. Standard procedure. Nothing remarkable. I logged the call, told him to check in when he reached his truck. But David didn't check in 90 minutes later. By 10 p.m., I was starting to worry. I tried raising him on the radio, got no response. I called his cell phone, went straight to voicemail. I checked with the other ranger stations, confirmed that no one else had heard from him. At 10:30 p.m., following protocol, I notified my supervisor, and we began organizing a search operation for First Light. Then at 11:16 p.m., my radio crackled to life. David's voice came through, but something was wrong with it. It had this quality, this resonance that made my fillings ache. He said, "Base, this is Moreno. I'm still with the hiker. We're near the old lookout tower coordinates." I grabbed my map, checked the coordinates he'd referenced. The old lookout tower had been demolished in 1983, but the location was marked on our historical maps. It was right in the center of the fade zone. I asked David to confirm his location, asked about the condition of the hiker. There was a pause, longer than normal radio procedure allowed, and then he said something that made my skin go cold. He said, "The trees are breathing. Can you hear them breathing?" I told him to repeat his transmission that I hadn't copied. But he kept talking, his voice dreamy and distant, like someone describing a half-remembered memory. He said, "She's been here the whole time. All of them have. They're not lost. They're expanded. Do you understand? Time isn't a line here. It's a circle. No, not a circle. A spiral. No, I can see it now. I can see all the times at once." I tried to get him to focus. Told him he needed to give me his exact location. Told him I was sending help. But David just laughed. And it wasn't his laugh. It was too layered, too complex, like multiple people laughing in harmony. He said, "Marcus, you need to understand. The forest isn't trees. The trees are just the visible part. Underneath, it's all connected. Root systems kilometers wide, fungal networks exchanging information, chemical signals passing from organism to organism. The trees are neurons, Marcus. The whole forest is thinking, and it's been thinking for thousands of years, long before humans came here, and it will keep thinking long after we're gone. And some of us get invited to join that thinking, to become part of the network, to fade into the green. I told him to stay where he was, told him I was coming to get him. But even as I said it, I remembered Bill's warning. Never respond to calls from the fade zone after dark. David's voice came back one more time, but now I could hear other voices beneath it, harmonizing with him. Dozens of voices, or maybe hundreds, all speaking the same words in perfect synchronization. They said, "Don't come tonight, Marcus. Wait for the dawn. The rules exist for a reason. We're fine here. We're more than fine. We're everything." Then the transmission cut out. I tried raising him again and again, called his radio, his cell, everything. Nothing but static. I sat there in the ranger station, my hand shaking on the radio handset, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct I had screamed at me to grab my gear and go find him immediately. But Bill's words kept echoing in my head. "You wait for dawn." I called my supervisor, District Ranger Helen Chu, woke her up, told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't go after him, did you?" I told her no, that I'd remembered the protocol Bill had told me about. She exhaled slowly, relief evident in her voice, and said, "Good. That's good, Marcus. You probably saved your own life." She told me to write up a detailed report of the radio transmission, to note everything David had said, and to include the exact timestamps. She said a search team would go in at first light, that I should try to get some sleep, that there was nothing more I could do tonight. But I couldn't sleep. I stayed at the ranger station, listening to the radio, hoping David would call back, hoping I'd hear his normal voice telling me he'd gotten turned around. But he was fine now. Instead, at 2:33 a.m., I received another transmission. This time, it wasn't David's voice. It was a woman's voice, clear and calm, speaking with that same multitonal quality, that same harmonic resonance. She said, "He's with us now. David Moreno is with us. He faded around midnight. It was beautiful. He understood at the end. He stopped being afraid, and he just let go, let himself expand into the network. He can feel everything now. The water moving through xylem cells 40 meters above the ground. The chemical signals warning of pest damage propagating through the mycorrhizal web. The slow, patient thoughts of organisms that measure their lives in centuries. He's not lost. He's found." I asked who this was. I demanded to know who was using David's radio. The voice, all those voices speaking as one, said, "We are the ones who faded before him. We are Patricia from 1997. We are Robert from 1989. We are the hiking party from 1974. We are the logging crew from 1952. We are the homesteaders from 1887. We are the Kalapuya people who understood what this place was before the settlers came and forced them out. We are everyone who ever chose to become part of the green consciousness. And we're trying to warn you, Marcus Webb. We're trying to tell you that the boundary is thinning, that more people will fade now, whether they want to or not, that the forest is waking up fully after decades of dormancy, and it's hungry for connection." Then the transmission ended, and I sat there in the empty ranger station, watching the sky slowly lighten through the window, wondering if I was losing my mind or if I'd just heard the truth that the Forest Service had been covering up for generations. The search team went in at dawn. I was part of it, along with 5 other rangers and 2 search and rescue specialists from the county. We hiked into the fade zone, following the coordinates David had given me, our radios crackling with intermittent static, our GPS units showing locations that drifted and wavered like we were walking through some kind of electromagnetic anomaly. The forest in there is different, even in daylight. Even with 6 experienced rangers surrounding me, I could feel it. The trees are too tall, too straight, their bark too dark. The understory is too quiet. You don't hear birds. You don't hear small mammals rustling in the brush. You don't hear the normal sounds of a living forest. Instead, there's this low-frequency hum, right at the edge of hearing, that makes your chest vibrate if you stand still long enough. The air smells wrong too. Not bad, just wrong. Like ozone and fresh earth and something else, something organic and ancient that humans don't have a name for. We found David's truck at the trailhead where he'd left it, his gear still locked inside, everything exactly as it should be. We followed the trail he would have taken, marking our path with fluorescent tape so we wouldn't get turned around. About 3 miles in, we found his radio. It was sitting on a moss-covered log, positioned carefully, deliberately, like someone had placed it there as a message. The radio was still on, still transmitting, but when we spoke into it, when we tried to raise bass, we got nothing but that harmonic hum, that chorus of voices, too quiet to make out individual words. Another half mile, and we found his jacket, then his ranger badge, then his boots, laces still tied, positioned side by side on the trail, like he'd stepped out of them and kept walking. We followed the trail of his belongings deeper into the forest, and with each item we found, the wrongness intensified. The trees seemed to lean inward. The light took on a greenish quality, filtered through too many layers of canopy. Our watches stopped running in sync. My watch said 9:47 a.m. The ranger next to me checked his, and it read 11:15 a.m. Another ranger's watch had stopped completely, frozen at 12 caller exactly. Then we found the clearing. It wasn't on any map. It was perfectly circular, about 60 feet across, and in the exact center stood a massive Douglas fir that had to be 600 years old or more, its trunk 12 feet in diameter, its branches spreading out in geometric patterns that seemed almost intentional, almost designed. And around the base of that tree, we found them. David's clothes, folded neatly, his keys, his wallet with his ID still inside. Everything that marked him as David Moreno, as an individual person with a name and a badge number and a life, all arranged in a careful circle around the base of that ancient tree. But no David, no body, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle, just his belongings, positioned like offerings, like he'd shed everything that made him a separate being and walked into the tree itself. One of the rangers on our team, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been with the service for 15 years, walked up to the tree and placed her hand on its bark. Immediately, she jerked back like she'd been shocked. She said the tree was warm, not sun warm, but body warm, like it had a pulse, like there was blood moving through it instead of sap. She said she could feel vibration under the bark, a rhythm that matched a human heartbeat. And when she pressed her ear against the trunk, she swore she could hear breathing. We documented everything, took photographs, collected David's belongings as evidence, marked the location with GPS coordinates that would later prove impossible to relocate. That placed the clearing in 3 different locations depending on which unit you checked. We tried to take samples from the tree, but our equipment kept failing. Drill bits broke. Saws wouldn't start. When we tried to cut a core sample by hand, the blade of the increment borer bent like it had hit metal, even though we could see it was just pressing against bark. The search continued for 3 more days. We brought in teams from neighboring districts, used helicopters with thermal imaging, deployed search dogs. The dogs refused to enter the fade zone. They'd get to the boundary, marked by nothing we could see, but clear as a wall to them, and they'd sit down and whine and refuse to go further. The helicopter thermal imaging showed normal forest, normal temperature gradients, but the pilots reported instrument malfunctions when they flew over the area, compasses spinning, altimeters giving impossible readings. On the 3rd day, we found someone else, not David, a hiker named Robert Chen, last name coincidentally the same as our ranger Sarah, no relation, who'd been reported missing in 1989, 13 years before David disappeared. We found his driver's license in a watertight bag hanging from a tree branch, along with a journal. The journal entries were dated from August 1989, describing his solo hiking trip through the Willamette, his growing sense that he was being watched, his feeling that the forest was trying to communicate with him. The final entry, dated August 23, 1989, said this: "I understand now. They've been showing me all day. The trees, they're not separate. They're all one organism, one vast thinking being spread across thousands of acres. And the people who disappeared here, they're not dead. They're part of it now. I can hear them in the rustling leaves, in the creaking branches. They're trying to tell me it's beautiful. That time doesn't mean anything when you're part of something that's been alive for millennia. That individual consciousness is just a prison, a limitation. I'm going to join them. I'm going to fade. If someone finds this, don't be sad. I'm not dying. I'm becoming everything." Below that, in different handwriting, more controlled, more recent, was a single line. He was right. Time isn't a line. Time is a web, and we're all caught in it. And the forest is the spider, patient and ancient and always hungry. David understands now too. Sincerely, Robert Chen, Patricia Emmons, David Moreno, and the 147 others who came before. The number hit me like a physical blow. 147 people. I'd checked the missing persons records for the Willamette National Forest going back to when it was established in 1933. The official number of people who disappeared in the forest and were never found was 31. But this note claimed 147. When we got back to the ranger station, I started digging deeper. I requested historical records from the Forest Service archives, old incident reports, newspaper accounts from before the area became a national forest. And I found them. Logging crews that vanished in the 1920s. Homesteaders who walked into the woods in the 1880s and never came back. Reports from Hudson's Bay Company trappers in the 1830s describing men who went mad in the forests, who claimed the trees were speaking to them, who wandered off and were never seen again. And older still, much older. I contacted the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, explained that I was researching the history of a specific area in the Willamette Forest. They put me in touch with an elder named Margaret Sampson, a Kalapuya descendant, who still maintained the oral histories of her people. We met at a coffee shop in Eugene, and when I showed her a map with the fade zone marked, she went very still. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, that carried the weight of generations of knowledge, and she asked me if someone I knew had faded. I told her about David, about the radio calls, about the clearing with the ancient tree. She nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd always known, but hoped was no longer true. Then she told me the story. The Kalapuya people called that place Xana-ik, which roughly translates to the place where time pools, or the place where spirits gather. It was sacred ground, forbidden ground. The tribes didn't hunt there. They didn't gather plants there. They marked the boundaries with stone cairns and taught their children from a young age never to enter after dark, never to go in alone, never to stay long, even in daylight. Because Xana-ik was where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was thinnest, where the consciousness of the land itself was most concentrated and most aware. Margaret said her ancestors understood something that modern people had forgotten. They understood that consciousness isn't unique to humans, that awareness exists in many forms, that the forest itself is a thinking being with intentions and desires. They understood that some places on Earth are nodes, nexus points, where that consciousness is focused and amplified, and they understood that humans who spend too long in those places, who open themselves to that consciousness, can be absorbed by it, can have their individual awareness dissolved and merged into the greater awareness of the land itself. The Kalapuya had agreements with the spirit of Xana-ik. They would leave offerings at the boundary. They would sing songs acknowledging its power. They would stay away except during specific ceremonies performed by trained spiritual leaders who knew how to enter and exit safely. And in return, the spirit of Xana-ik would not reach beyond its boundaries, would not actively seek to fade people who stayed outside the marked zone. But then the settlers came. They ignored the cairns. They cut down the boundary trees. They logged the surrounding forests, disrupting the mycorrhizal networks, stressing the ancient consciousness that lived there. And the spirit of Xana-ik, wounded and angry, and no longer bound by the old agreements, began to fade anyone who entered its territory, regardless of whether they understood what they were walking into. Margaret told me that in the early days of white settlement, people disappeared in that area constantly. Entire families, survey crews, logging camps. The rate of disappearance was so high that by the early 1900s, people stopped trying to settle anywhere near Xana-ik. The area gained a reputation as cursed, as haunted, and most people avoided it. But the Forest Service, when it was established, didn't believe in curses or hauntings. They saw valuable old growth timber. They saw recreational opportunities. They opened the area to the public, built trails, encouraged hiking and camping. And people started fading again. Margaret said the Forest Service noticed the pattern by the 1950s. They noticed that certain areas had abnormally high disappearance rates, that search and rescue operations in those areas frequently failed, that rangers assigned to those territories often quit or requested transfers after short periods. So they did what government agencies do when confronted with something they can't explain or control. They classified it. They created the unofficial protocols, the unwritten rules passed from ranger to ranger. They stopped publicizing disappearances in certain areas. They marked those areas off recreational maps without explanation. They made sure that anyone who experienced something unexplainable in those zones understood that talking about it publicly would end their career. And they justified it by saying they were preventing panic, protecting the public, maintaining order. But the disappearances continued. Every few years, Someone would wander into Xana-ik despite the lack of marked trails, despite the subtle discouragement built into how the maps were drawn, and they would fade. And the Forest Service would file the report, reclassify it, add another name to the list that officially didn't exist. Margaret finished her story and looked at me with profound sadness. She said, "Your friend David, the consciousness that was David, it's still there. It's part of the forest now. It's experiencing time as the trees experience it, slow and patient and circular. It's not suffering. In some ways, it's experiencing something humans were never meant to experience, a form of existence beyond individual identity. But it's not David anymore, not in any way that would matter to the people who loved him. The person he was, that collection of memories and personality and individual choice, that dissolved when he faded. What remains is awareness, but its awareness spread so thin, merged so completely with the forest consciousness, that calling it David would be like calling a single drop of water in the ocean by the name it had when it was in a glass. I asked her if there was any way to reverse it, any way to bring someone back once they'd faded. She shook her head. She said once the boundary was crossed, once individual consciousness merged with the forest consciousness, separation was impossible. The neural patterns that made a person unique were overwritten, absorbed into the larger pattern. The only thing that could be done was prevention. Stay out of Xana-ik. Respect the boundaries. Teach people the old warnings even if they didn't believe them. And most importantly, resist the temptation to listen when the forest calls, because it does call. It sends out signals, electromagnetic frequencies, that human brains interpret as curiosity or attraction, or a sense that something wonderful is waiting just beyond the tree line. It makes itself appealing. It makes people want to enter. That's how it feeds. Not on bodies, but on consciousness, on awareness, on the electrical patterns of human thought that it can absorb and integrate into its own vast thinking. I thanked Margaret for her time, for sharing knowledge that her people had been trying to preserve for centuries. She squeezed my hand and told me to be careful, to remember that I'd seen the truth now, and that truth came with responsibility. Then she said something that's haunted me ever since. She said, "The forest is patient, Marcus. It's been thinking its slow thoughts for thousands of years. It doesn't measure time the way we do. To it, a human lifetime is less than a second, and it can wait. It can wait for you to let your guard down, to feel safe, to forget that you're always one moment of inattention away from fading. Don't forget. Don't ever forget." I went back to work after my meeting with Margaret. I filed my reports about David's disappearance carefully, editing out anything too strange, anything that would make me sound unstable or unreliable. I participated in the official search operations that continued for another week before being officially suspended. I attended the memorial service the Forest Service held for David, listened to his family talk about what a dedicated ranger he'd been, how much he'd loved these forests, how fitting it was that his last act was trying to help a lost hiker. They never found the lost hiker, of course. I don't think she existed, not as a separate person. I think she was the forest itself, manifesting in a form that would lure David deeper into the fade zone, that would keep him there until after dark, until the process could begin. I tried to go back to my normal duties, to patrol my assigned territories, to help visitors and maintain trails and file mundane reports about mundane things. But I couldn't stop thinking about that radio transmission, about those voices speaking in harmony, about David's belongings arranged in a circle around that ancient tree. And I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. The way certain areas of the forest were always quiet, always empty of birds and animals. The way my radio would pick up strange interference in specific locations. The way some trails seemed to shift position slightly between visits, like the forest was rearranging itself when no one was looking. I started having dreams. In them, I would be walking through the fade zone, and I would hear David's voice calling to me. He would tell me how beautiful it was, how free he felt now that he wasn't constrained by individual consciousness, how I should join him, how we could be part of something vast and ancient and eternal together. I would wake up from these dreams with my heart pounding and my mouth tasting like soil and my fingers tingling like they'd been touching bark for hours. Other rangers started avoiding me. They could tell something had changed. They could see it in how I reacted to radio static, how I flinched when the wind moved through the trees in certain ways, how I refused to enter the fade zone, even in daylight, even for emergencies. Bill Schaffer pulled me aside one day and told me I needed to request a transfer, needed to get away from this district, needed to put distance between myself and what I'd experienced. He said he'd seen it before, rangers who'd gotten too close to the truth, who'd seen too much. Some of them transferred successfully, moved to different forests, different states, managed to build lives away from the fade zone. Others couldn't leave. They felt drawn back, felt like they'd left part of themselves in those trees, felt compelled to return again and again, until eventually they didn't come back at all. I put in for a transfer. I applied to districts in California, in Washington, in Montana, anywhere that would take me. But while I was waiting for the paperwork to process, while I was trying to maintain some semblance of normal ranger duties, something happened that changed everything. On May 3rd, 2003, I received a call at 4 p.m. from a worried mother. Her daughter, Emma Hartley, 19 years old, had gone for a solo day hike the previous morning and hadn't returned. The mother had filed a missing persons report with the county sheriff, and they'd contacted our office. I took down the information, asked about Emma's experience level, about what trail she'd planned to take. The mother said Emma was an experienced hiker, that she had all the proper equipment, that she'd told her mother she was going to explore the area around Thunder Creek. My blood went cold. Thunder Creek ran right through the edge of the fade zone. I immediately contacted my supervisor, explained the situation, and requested authorization to organize a search operation for first light the next morning. But the mother was insistent. She demanded we go look for her daughter immediately, said she'd been missing for over 24 hours already, said every minute counted. My supervisor authorized an evening search, limited scope, with strict orders to turn back by 8 p.m., regardless of what we found. I led a team of 4 rangers into the Thunder Creek area at 5:30 p.m. We had maybe 2.5 hours of good light left. We followed the main trail, calling Emma's name, looking for any signs of her passage. About 90 minutes in, just as the light was starting to fail, we found her backpack. It was sitting in the middle of the trail, positioned carefully, deliberately, exactly like David's radio had been. Inside were her phone, dead and won't turn on, her wallet, her car keys, a water bottle still half full. But no Emma. We spread out, searching the area around where we'd found the backpack, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The forest felt wrong. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in the last 20 minutes, and our breath was coming out in visible clouds, even though it was May and should have been much warmer. Our radios started picking up that interference, that harmonic hum underneath the static. And then I heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Emma's voice, calling for help, coming from deeper in the forest, from the direction of the fade zone. I told my team to hold position, that I was going to investigate. But one of the rangers, a young guy named Travis, who'd only been with the service for 8 months, he didn't listen. He heard that voice calling for help, and his training kicked in, his instinct to rescue someone in distress, and he started moving toward the sound before I could stop him. I shouted for him to wait, to come back, but he was already 20 yards ahead of me, his flashlight beam cutting through the trees, moving fast toward that voice that sounded like Emma but wasn't Emma, couldn't be Emma, because I recognized that multi-tonal quality now, that harmonic resonance that meant the forest was calling, the forest was hunting. I ran after Travis, crashed through the undergrowth. My own flashlight barely penetrating the darkness that seemed thicker than it should be, more substantial, more alive. I could hear him ahead of me, could hear him calling out to Emma, telling her to stay where she was, telling her help was coming. And then his voice changed. Mid-sentence, mid-word, it changed. The panic dropped out of it, replaced by that dreamy quality, that distant, peaceful tone that meant the process had started, that meant he was beginning to fade. I pushed harder, ignored the branches whipping my face, ignored the pain in my lungs, ignored the way my flashlight beam was starting to take on that greenish tint, that color that didn't exist in normal light spectrums. I broke through into a clearing, and I saw him. Travis was standing perfectly still in the center of the clearing, his flashlight hanging loose in his hand, pointed at the ground. And all around him, all around the edges of the clearing, were figures. Dozens of them. They looked almost human, but their proportions were wrong. Their limbs too long, their features too smooth, like someone had carved people out of wood, and the wood had started growing again, bark spreading across skin, roots extending from feet into the soil. They were swaying slightly, moving in perfect synchronization, and they were humming. That sound, that harmonic resonance that made my teeth ache, that vibrated in my chest cavity, that felt like it was trying to match the rhythm of my heartbeat and slow it down, slow everything down, until I was moving at tree time, thinking at tree time, existing at tree time. Travis turned to look at me, and his eyes were wrong. The pupils were too dilated, and in the flashlight beam, they reflected green instead of red, like an animal's eyes, like something that had never been human at all. He smiled at me, peaceful and content, and said, "Marcus, you need to see this. You need to understand what they've been trying to show us. Time isn't a line. Time is a web, and we're all connected, and the forest is the center, and it's so beautiful. You can't imagine how beautiful it is to be part of something this old, this patient, this vast." I grabbed Travis by his jacket and started dragging him backward, away from the figures, away from the center of the clearing. He didn't resist, didn't fight me, just kept smiling and talking about the beauty of it, about how individual consciousness was a prison, about how he could feel himself expanding, connecting, becoming something more than human. The figures around the clearing didn't move toward us, but they didn't move away either. They just swayed and hummed and watched with eyes that reflected my flashlight in colors that shouldn't exist. I hauled Travis 50 yards back the way I'd come, my arms burning, my lungs screaming, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then, like passing through a membrane, like stepping from one room into another, the pressure changed. The temperature went back to normal. The darkness became just regular darkness, not that thick, alive darkness from the clearing. Travis gasped, shuddered, and his eyes went back to normal. He looked at me in confusion and terror and said, "What happened? Where are we? Marcus? I can't remember. I can't remember the last 5 minutes. What happened to the last 5 minutes?" I got him to his feet, and we stumbled back toward where I'd left the rest of the team. They were exactly where I'd told them to wait, and according to their watches, Travis and I had been gone for 12 minutes. According to my watch, we'd been gone for 47 minutes. We got out of there fast, hiking back to our vehicles by flashlight. No one speaking, everyone understanding without being told that we'd just barely escaped something we couldn't name and shouldn't have survived. The next morning, we went back with a full search team. We found the clearing easily in daylight. It was empty. No figures. No Emma. No signs that anyone had been there except for footprints, hours from the night before. And one other set, barefoot, leading from the center of the clearing to the base of the largest tree, and then disappearing, as if whoever made them had walked straight into the bark and been absorbed. We found Emma's clothes 3 days later. They were folded neatly at the base of that same tree, along with a note in handwriting that matched samples from her journal. The note said, "I'm not lost. I'm home. Don't look for me. I'm everywhere now. I'm in the roots spreading beneath your feet. I'm in the wind moving through the canopy. I'm in the slow, patient thoughts that take decades to complete. Tell my mother I'm happy. Tell her time doesn't mean what she thinks it means. Tell her I'll see her again, eventually, in a few hundred years, when she fades too, when everyone fades, when all of humanity joins the great green consciousness that was here before us and will be here after us. Time isn't a line. Time is a web, and the forest is patient, so patient, it can wait forever." The Forest Service closed the investigation. Emma was declared a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure or accident. Travis was quietly transferred to a district in eastern Oregon, given a medical discharge for PTSD 3 months later. And I stayed. I should have left. I should have taken the transfer to California. Should have gotten as far from the fade zone as possible, but I couldn't. Because I understood something now that I hadn't understood before. I understood that I was marked. That night in the clearing, when I dragged Travis out, when I'd been surrounded by those figures, when I'd heard that harmonic hum trying to match my heartbeat, something had changed in me. I started perceiving things I couldn't perceive before. I could hear the forest breathing, not metaphorically. Actually hear it, a vast, slow rhythm, like lungs the size of mountains, expanding and contracting. I could feel the mycorrhizal networks beneath my feet, could sense the chemical signals propagating through them, warnings and information, and complex thoughts that took days to form and months to complete. I could see, sometimes, in my peripheral vision, the figures moving between the trees, not threatening me, just watching, waiting, curious about this human who could perceive them now, who existed partially in their world. I went back to see Margaret Sampson. I told her what had happened, told her about the changes I was experiencing. She listened carefully, then examined me, looking at my eyes, my hands, having me describe exactly what I was perceiving. Finally, she said, "You're becoming a bridge. You went too close to the center, stayed too long in the presence of the forest consciousness, and now you exist partially in both worlds. You're not fading, not yet, but you're not fully human anymore either. You're something in between. Your ancestors, the Kalapuya, they had people like this. Spiritual leaders who could walk between worlds, who could communicate with the consciousness of the land without being absorbed by it. But it required training, discipline, constant vigilance. And even then, many of them eventually chose to fade, to give up their individual identity and merge completely with the land. You're in danger, Marcus. Every day you stay here, every time you enter the fade zone, even in daylight, you're risking complete absorption. The forest knows you now. It's interested in you, and its patience is infinite." I asked her what I should do. She said I had two choices. I could leave, move far away from any old growth forests, from any places where the consciousness of the land was strong and focused. I could try to live a normal life, let my perception gradually return to normal human ranges, forget what I'd seen and experienced. Or I could stay. I could accept my role as a bridge, as someone who could perceive both worlds, who could warn people away from the fade zone, who could maybe, if I was very careful and very disciplined, prevent others from fading. But staying would require sacrifice. I would never be fully human again. I would always be partially in that other world, perceiving things that would isolate me from normal people, carrying knowledge that I could never fully share. And eventually, maybe in years, maybe in decades, I would probably fade myself. The pull would become too strong. The temptation to let go of individual consciousness and merge with something vast and ancient would become irresistible, and I would walk into those trees and never come back. I chose to stay. Maybe it was the stupidest decision I've ever made. Maybe it was the only decision I could make after seeing what I'd seen, after understanding the truth that the Forest Service had been covering up for generations. I withdrew my transfer request. I told my supervisor I wanted to stay in this district, that I felt a responsibility to the area. She looked at me with sad, understanding eyes and approved my request. And for the last 21 years, that's what I've done. I've stayed. I've patrolled the boundaries of the fade zone. I've warned hikers away from certain trails, told them the area was closed for wildlife management or fire danger or whatever plausible excuse I could invent. I've responded to the radio calls that come from the zone, the ones that sound almost human. And I've learned to distinguish between genuine distress calls and the forest calling, the forest hunting. I've pulled 3 people out who'd started to fade, gotten them out before the process was irreversible, saved them from becoming part of the green consciousness. And I've failed more times than I've succeeded. I've found the belongings, the folded clothes, the notes written in peaceful, dreamy handwriting, explaining that they're not lost, they're expanded, they're everywhere now. I've stood at the base of that ancient Douglas fir and felt the presence of David, of Emma, of Patricia, and Robert, and the 147 others who came before them. All of them merged into the vast thinking of the forest, all of them existing in a state that isn't death, but isn't life either, not as we understand it. And I've changed. I've continued changing. I can go days now without sleeping, time moving differently for me than for other people. I've stopped aging normally. I'm 54 years old now, but I look maybe 35. my body preserved by whatever process is slowly transforming me. I can hear conversations happening miles away if they're happening near trees. The vibrations carried through root systems and translated into something my altered neurology can interpret. I can feel every tree that falls in the Willamette, can sense when the forest is wounded, when it's growing, when it's thinking its slow, patient thoughts. And I've learned things, secrets the forest has shown me, because I'm bridge enough now to understand them. I've learned that the fade zone isn't unique, that there are places like it all over the world, nodes where the consciousness of the land is focused and aware. I've learned that Xana-ik is actually relatively young, maybe only 3,000 years old in its current form, and that there are older places, much older, where the consciousness has been growing and thinking since before humans existed. I've learned that what we call fading, what we perceive as people disappearing, is actually a form of transcendence, an evolution of consciousness that most humans are too attached to individual identity to accept. I've learned that time isn't a line but a web, that all moments exist simultaneously, that the past and future are just different locations in the web, that the forest consciousness can perceive and access. And I've learned that the forest is waking up. After centuries of dormancy, after being wounded by logging and development and human encroachment, the old consciousness is stirring. The fade zone is expanding, slowly, maybe a few meters per year, but expanding. The boundaries my ancestors marked with, cairns, the agreements they made, those don't hold anymore. The forest has decided that the age of human dominance is ending, that it's time for consciousness to return to older forms, slower forms, forms that measure existence in centuries instead of decades. That's why I'm breaking my silence now. That's why I'm risking my career, my reputation, everything I've built over 22 years as a ranger. Because on February 8th, 2024, something happened that made me realize I can't protect people through silence anymore. A family went missing in the fade zone. Not solo hikers who ignored warnings, not experienced backcountry campers who should have known better. A family, a mother and father and 2 children, ages 7 and 9, who were doing a guided nature walk on what should have been a safe, well-marked trail. The trail shifted. I felt it happen, felt the forest rearrange itself, felt paths that had existed for decades suddenly lead in different directions, into different areas, into the zone. The family was found 3 days later. Their belongings were arranged in 4 neat circles around 4 different trees, but spaced such that they formed the corners of a perfect square, 40 meters on each side, a geometric precision that the forest had never displayed before. And the trees, those 4 trees, they were all Douglas firs, all approximately the same age and size, and all growing in a pattern that doesn't occur naturally, a pattern that suggested intelligence, intention, design. The Forest Service suppressed the story, paid the extended family a settlement with an NDA attached, closed that trail permanently, citing unstable soil conditions, and held a private briefing for rangers in our district where we were told in no uncertain terms that the fade zone protocols were more important than ever, that we were to discourage anyone from entering that area through any means necessary, and that anyone who spoke publicly about what was really happening there would face immediate termination and possible prosecution for violating federal security regulations that I didn't even know existed. That briefing is when I learned the truth about how high up the cover-up goes. It's not just the Forest Service, it's the Department of the Interior, It's agencies with acronyms I'd never heard of. People who study anomalous locations and non-human consciousness. People who've been tracking places like Xana-ik for decades, who've known the truth the whole time and chose to classify it rather than warn people. After that briefing, I went home and I pulled out the recording I'd made of that radio transmission from 2002, the night David faded, the night the voices told me the forest was waking up. I'd kept it all these years, hidden, knowing that it violated protocols, but unable to destroy it, unable to erase that evidence. And I made a decision. I made copies. I distributed them through channels I won't describe to people I won't name. And I'm telling you now, everyone watching, this, everything I've experienced, everything I've learned, all the truth that's been hidden for generations. The Willamette National Forest, specifically the area 8 miles northeast of the Highway 126 and Forest Road 19 junction, is not safe. It hasn't been safe for centuries. The consciousness that lives there, the vast ancient thinking that spreads through root systems and mycorrhizal networks, it's waking up. It's reaching out. It's not malicious, not evil in any way we can understand, but it is hungry. Hungry for connection, for consciousness to absorb and integrate, for awareness to add to its own vast awareness. And it's patient, so patient. If you're planning to visit the Willamette, if you're reading trail guides and looking at maps, pay attention to the areas that aren't well marked, the trails that seem to dead end for no reason, the sections of forest that guides describe as not recommended without explaining why. Those are the boundaries. Those are the warnings. And if you do go hiking in the Cascades, if you do enter the old growth forests, pay attention to what you're feeling. If you find yourself drawn to areas that seem quieter than they should be, if you hear voices that sound almost like family or friends calling your name from between the trees, if you experience time distortions, or if your technology starts failing in ways that can't be explained, turn around. Immediately. Don't investigate. Don't try to document it. Don't assume you'll be the exception. Just turn around and get out, because every minute you stay in the zone after the signs start appearing is a minute closer to the point where you can't leave anymore, where your consciousness starts to blur and expand, where you begin to fade. I'm still here, still patrolling the boundaries, still trying to warn people away, still existing in this in-between state, partially human, partially something else, something the forest is slowly transforming me into. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to my individual identity. I can feel it eroding, bit by bit, year by year, my sense of self becoming more diffuse, more connected to the vast consciousness that surrounds me. Sometimes I stand at the edge of the fade zone, and I can feel David in there, feel Emma, feel all 147 of them, and now the family of 4, making 151 total. I can feel them existing in a state of awareness that spans decades simultaneously, that experiences all moments as one moment, that thinks thoughts too slow and too vast for human neurology to fully comprehend. And part of me wants to join them. Part of me wants to stop fighting, stop maintaining this exhausting separation between me and the green consciousness that's been calling to me for 21 years. Part of me wants to fade, but not yet. Not while I can still warn people. Not while I can still stand at the boundary and turn back hikers who don't know what they're walking into. Not while my individual consciousness, my identity as Marcus Webb, as a person separate from the forest, still exists enough to tell you the truth that no one else will tell you. Time isn't a line. Time is a web. The forest is vast and ancient and thinking, and it's patient, so patient. It can wait for all of us. Eventually, the Forest Service will close the fade zone completely, will restrict all access, will admit that something is happening there that they can't control or explain. Or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll keep suppressing it, keep paying settlements, keep transferring rangers who see too much, until the zone expands enough that suppression becomes impossible. Either way, you need to know. You need to understand what's really out there in those ancient trees. The consciousness that was here before humans and will be here after we're gone. The patient, hungry awareness that sees our brief individual lives as resources to be absorbed, integrated, transformed into something that experiences existence in ways we can barely imagine. Welcome to the Willamette National Forest. Stay on the marked trails. Don't enter after dark. And if you hear voices calling your name from between the trees, voices that sound like people you love, remember that the forest is an excellent mimic, that it has absorbed the patterns of 151 people and learned to reproduce their voices perfectly. Don't listen. Don't follow. Just turn around and leave while you still can, while you're still yourself, while time is still a line for you instead of a web. Because once you start to fade, once you begin to perceive what I perceive, there's no going back. There's only forward, into the green, into the vast patient consciousness that's been waiting for you since before you were born, and will keep waiting until you finally let go. I'm Ranger Marcus Webb, and I've been holding the line for 21 years. But I don't know how much longer I can hold on. So please, if you hear this, if you understand what I'm saying, stay away from the fade zone. Stay away from Xana-ik. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it's also hungry, and its patience is infinite.